Good morning, responsible business leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you to decide which category you fall into. Let me start by answering the question. 2009, I was working in Shell for the sustainability department. I took over as editor last February, and I can tell you my position on climate change and global warming is completely different, and I'll explain why. I wanted to thank you for allowing me to join this discussion on this bright, sunny morning. And it might seem an odd way to start a presentation, but I can tell you a few months ago in this town, blue skies and sunny mornings were not to be taken for granted. In fact, I remember coming for a lunch in one of the fine restaurants in Marina Bay and being told that the open air deck was closed for the day, so we had to dine indoors, and we looked out through the windows and all you saw was a blanket of gray, no sign of the lovely Singapore skyline to be seen. That day, the pollution standards index in Singapore hit 401, a new record, and all of a sudden, everybody in this town became interested in pollution and sustainable development. All of a sudden, people were checking their iPhones, their iPads, their computers to find out what was the latest PSI. People were coming to our websites, our page views went through the roof, and people were trying to find out what was going on in the ground from our reporters in Singapore, in Sumatra, and all around the region. There were many instant experts on the PSI and the PM 2.5 index, which measures small particulate matter in the atmosphere. I remember driving into a petrol station to fill up the tank of my car. And the attendant immediately told me, "Sir, please go into the kiosk because the air is poisonous." My colleague Cheng Kun is here in the audience somewhere, and he wrote a good piece to try and explain the PM 2.5. I found the whole discussion quite ironic because the PM 2.5 levels in this town has been higher than in many other cities around the world for many years without many people being too bothered about it. And in fact, national committees, including one of which that I chaired, have made arguments for moves to be made to raise our fuel specifications and regulations, but these got very little traction simply because there was little public support for any measure which would lead to higher transport costs and bus fares, so they couldn't fly. At the height of the haze, ASEAN governments and leaders were prodded into action. They pledged cooperation, they pledged to share information, and to bring the forest burners to justice. That burning resolve, unfortunately, seems to have cooled somewhat as the haze has receded and the crisis has passed. So we risk a rerun of previous rounds of ASEAN diplomacy, which we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s, full of sound and fury, but ultimately signifying not very much. At the height of the haze, we saw big plantation owners quick to declare that the burning was not happening on their patch and to trumpet their zero-burn policies. At the time, I wrote a piece in the Straits Times which said that zero-burning policies were all well and good, but it's not quite enough. To be meaningful, they have to ensure that these are strictly enforced on their contractors and subcontractors right down the supply chain. And to make that happen, they will have to offer contracts which give operators on the ground every incentive to comply, paying for the more costly methods of clearing land and sustainable farming practices, and penalizing those who don't by dropping them as partners. None of this will be cost-free, but just as these firms have enjoyed tidy profits from their plantations, they must be ready to make the investments required to ensure that the externalities or the social side effects from their operations are properly addressed and accounted for. And just to be fair, I also added the point that these extra costs will have to be borne by all of us, including consumers. At the height of the haze, the consumers were crying out for action. There were many threats to boycott products and errand firms which did not practice sustainable farming. It was clear to all of us that companies which were not going to adopt sustainable practices simply as charity, but only if it affects their bottom line, They would move quickly to do so only if they realized that being seen to be one of the people who were burning the forest or having partners who were polluters would tarnish their reputations and hit their business. Now, it was around this time, at the height of the haze, when the organizers of this event, Tony Gole and Jessica Chiam, formerly from the Straits Times, came to me to ask for the Straits Times to be a partner for this summit. Presumably, Jessica knew that my position was quite different from the previous editorial that had run. Now, I agreed quite readily, not only because I felt that these issues were of interest and concern to our readers, but also because I felt that the political wind would soon change, and attention spans being very short, this issue of the haze and climate change would soon fade from the headlines. And I felt that we in the media, including the Straits Times, had a responsibility to keep these issues on the agenda and remind key players that if we didn't do something to address the underlying causes of these issues, then we would have a recurrence of the choking haze that hit this town next year or in the years ahead. But of course, our environmental challenges go much further beyond the haze and the pollution in the air, which we can literally see and smell right before our eyes and our noses. We all know that we are faced with much larger challenges of rising greenhouse gases, much harder to do much about because these are colorless, odorless, and the implications and the effects of these pollutants don't play out until many years down the road. So, to this previous speaker's big shift, I would say that the big shift for ASEAN, which is pledging to form a community by 2015, is really this. If ASEAN as a community has been so languid in getting together to tackle the haze, how much more difficult is it going to be to tackle the challenge of climate change? And this is a huge challenge facing all of us in the ASEAN community, because according to the Asian Development Bank, it is countries in this part of the world, in our region, in Southeast Asia, which will be harder hit than most others by rising temperatures and sea levels. It's simple to see why. Countries in this part of the world have long coastlines. We rely very heavily on agriculture. We have high incidences of tropical diseases, all of which will compound problems related to climate change. And indeed, a World Bank report earlier this year pointed to Jakarta, Bangkok, and Ho Chi Minh as three cities which will bear the brunt of flooding which come from rising sea levels. So I read the remarks made by the minister yesterday saying that it's going to take more natural disasters before minds are focused and popular pressures rise for something to be done about global warming and climate change. But I've also been reading, and I'm sure you have too, all the reports that have been coming out from our correspondents in the Philippines and from others of the devastation that has been wrought and the heartbreaking stories of millions of people struggling to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. You can't help but be moved by those pictures and those stories and those videos, and if you haven't already seen it, st.com is the place to look for it. Of course, none of us can say that the super typhoon Haiyan was caused by climate change or global warming, as we all know that causality is extremely difficult to establish. But we all also know that scientists are in agreement that such extreme weather patterns will become more common in the years ahead if we do nothing to address the challenge of concentrations of greenhouse gases rising. So the reality in ASEAN is that if we don't do anything, we are consigning ourselves to a future of more heartbreaking stories like the ones we see coming out of Tacloban today. So in that sense, we have been warned. And I don't think any of us in this room or beyond can honestly say that we do not have enough information to make responsible business decisions. I hope that answers your question about my newspaper's position on this issue. And that is why the Straits Times is on board with you in this summit, and that is why we are media partners and why we will continue to put these issues on the table, on the agenda, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your deliberations over the next few days. Last night at the opening dinner, there was a gentleman who said he told his mother that he was coming to this conference. And she said, oh, and what are you going to do at the conference? And he said, well, we're going to talk and discuss what we might do as responsible business leaders to deal with climate change. And she said, oh, and all that talking is going to make a difference? And so I asked my wife this morning what she made of this conference. And her answer was quite interesting, so I thought I'd share it with you. She said, tell everybody in the room, we've had enough hot air in this town for 1 year, so please do something about it. So I hope your deliberations will help do something about it. Thank you.